3 weeks before I was supposed to start graduate school, I learned my college fund was gone. Not reduced, not delayed, gone. Every dollar my grandmother had saved for my education, 29 years of birthdays, Christmas checks, and careful monthly deposits had disappeared from the account. And the strangest part, my parents had used it to buy my brother a house. When I asked my mother why she didn't hesitate, she didn't apologize. She just looked at me across the kitchen table and said very calmly, "Because he's the one who matters." I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I picked up my phone and called my grandmother. What happened after she found out is the reason my parents still refuse to speak to me today. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This started on a Tuesday morning in early March, a cold, gray morning in Boise, Idaho. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 29 years old, and until that day, I believed my family was ordinary. Not perfect, but ordinary in the way most families are. Some tension, some misunderstandings, but nothing that couldn't be worked through over time. I was sitting at the small kitchen table in my apartment laptop, open a mug of coffee going cold beside me. I had the university enrollment page pulled up on the screen. After years of working as a second-grade teacher in Boise Public Schools, I'd finally been accepted into a master's program in education. The tuition payment deadline was coming up fast. I needed to confirm the transfer from my college fund. That fund had been part of my life story for as long as I could remember. My grandmother, Margaret Lewis, started it the year I was born. She used to joke that every time she skipped buying a new pair of shoes, another few dollars went into Claire's future. When I was a kid, she showed me the statements once a year, not to brag, but to remind me someone believed in my education. By the time I finished college, the first time, most of the money had remained untouched. I'd worked part-time, taken smaller loans, and saved the rest for graduate school. At least that was the plan. I dialed the bank just to confirm the transfer instructions. The woman who answered sounded cheerful, the kind of calm professionalism you expect from someone who handles financial questions all day. She asked for my name, my date of birth, and the last 4 digits of my Social Security number. I gave them without thinking. There was a pause on the line. Not long, just long enough for the quiet to feel strange. "Ms. Bennett," she said finally, her voice more careful now. "I'm showing the current balance on that account as $214. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because that was the only reaction my brain could produce. "That can't be right," I said. "The account should have around 80,000. More typing on her keyboard. "I'm looking at the transaction history," she replied. "There have been multiple withdrawals over the past several months." "Withdrawals," I repeated. "Yes, ma'am. Authorized by the account custodian, Robert Bennett, my father." The refrigerator hummed behind me. Outside the window, a car passed slowly through the slushy street. Everything looked completely normal. But inside my chest, something had shifted. "How much was taken out?" I asked. She hesitated again. "Most of the funds," she said gently. Then she read off the name of the company that received the largest transfer, a real estate firm in Meridian, Idaho. And suddenly, I remembered something my brother Ethan had mentioned the previous weekend. He'd bought a house. That afternoon, I drove to my parents' house in Meridian. The sky was still the dull gray color that Boise seems to wear through most of early spring. Dirty snow clung to the sides of the road, melting slowly into narrow streams along the gutters. The drive from my apartment usually took 20 minutes, but it felt longer that day. I kept replaying the bank call in my mind. $214. The number sat in my thoughts like a stone. I tried to come up with other explanations. Maybe the bank had mixed up the account. Maybe Dad had moved the money somewhere else temporarily. Maybe there was some complicated financial reason I didn't understand yet. Families help each other, I told myself. Sometimes money moves around. My parents' house looked exactly the way it always had. A 2-story beige place at the end of a quiet street with a maple tree in the front yard that my brother Ethan and I used to climb when we were kids. Dad's pickup truck was parked in the driveway. And there was another car there too, Ethan's silver SUV. I walked up the front steps and let myself in. The smell of garlic and onions drifted from the kitchen. My mother, Linda Bennett, was standing at the stove, stirring something in a pot. She turned when she heard the door. "Claire," she said, sounding pleasantly surprised. "I didn't know you were coming by." My father, Robert Bennett, sat at the kitchen table reading the local newspaper. He glanced up over his glasses and gave me a small nod. "Hey, kiddo." And then Ethan walked in from the hallway. My older brother was 34, tall like Dad, with the kind of easy confidence that made people like him right away. He worked in landscaping on and off, depending on the season, and somehow always managed to land on his feet, even when things didn't go exactly according to plan. "Speak of the devil," he said with a grin. "Mom was just telling me you got into that grad program." I nodded, setting my purse down on the chair. "Yeah, I start in a few weeks." "Good for you," he said. Dinner came together quickly. Mom set out plates. Dad folded the newspaper, and we all sat around the table the way we had thousands of times before. For a few minutes, the conversation was ordinary. Work, weather, the university schedule. Then Ethan reached for his phone. "Hey," he said, turning the screen toward our parents. The realtor sent over the final photos. Mom leaned closer immediately. "Oh, let me see." I could hear the pride in her voice before I even looked. Ethan tapped the screen and held the phone out so everyone could see. It was a picture of a house, a neat 1-story place with white siding, a 2-car garage, and a small front porch. The yard looked newly landscaped, fresh mulch around the flower beds. "Closed last week," Ethan said. "Finally got the keys." Dad gave an approving nod. "Nice place." Mom looked like someone who had just won a prize. "Isn't it perfect?" she said. "Your brother's first home." I stared at the photo longer than I meant to. Something about it made my stomach tighten. "Congratulations," I said. Ethan smiled. "Thanks. It's a bit of a stretch financially, but Mom and Dad helped make it work." Mom gave a small wave of her hand, brushing the comment aside. Family helps family. For a moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the clink of silverware against plates. I felt the bank statement sitting in my purse like a secret. "Mom," I said carefully, "I called the bank today about my college fund." She didn't look up right away. She kept cutting her chicken into small pieces. "Oh," she said. "They told me the balance is basically gone." Now she looked up, but she didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked calm. Dad suddenly found something very interesting about his plate. Ethan's smile faded slightly. Mom folded her hands together on the table. "Well," she said lightly, "that's because we used it." The words landed softly, but they hit just the same. "Used it," I repeated. "For Ethan's house," she said, as if it were the most reasonable explanation in the world. My chest tightened. That was my college fund. Mom tilted her head, studying me. "Yes, Claire," she said patiently. "But Ethan needed stability, a home of his own." She gave a small shrug. "And honestly," she smiled at my brother, "he's the one who matters." I drove home with my hands locked on the steering wheel, like it was the only thing keeping me upright. Meridian blurred past. Past the windows, strip malls, gas stations. The same familiar intersections I'd driven through my whole life. The radio was off. I couldn't stand noise. I couldn't stand the idea of anyone else's voice in my head, while my mother's words kept replaying calm and final. He's the one who matters. I kept waiting for the feeling to catch up to me. Rage, tears, something loud. But all I felt was this low, steady pressure, like a storm sitting just beyond the horizon. When I got back to my apartment in Boise, I didn't even take off my coat. I set my purse on the counter and pulled out the printout I'd grabbed from the bank's online portal earlier that morning. It wasn't the full statement, just the last few transactions and the balance. $214.06. The number looked unreal in black ink. I opened my laptop and logged into the bank site again, as if staring harder could change what I'd seen. The transaction list was still there, withdrawal after withdrawal. A larger transfer labeled with the same Meridian Real Estate Company the bank representative had read to me over the phone. I clicked on the details, my fingers cold against the trackpad. All it showed was the date, the amount, and a reference number. No explanation, no note, just proof that the money had moved. For a moment, I thought about going back over there, driving straight to my parents' house and demanding they fix it right then, right now. I pictured myself standing in that kitchen, raising my voice, forcing my father to look at me, forcing my mother to say the words again with witnesses. But I already knew how that scene would play out. My mom would cry if it helped her, or she wouldn't if crying didn't work. She'd tell me I was being dramatic. She'd remind me of every meal she ever cooked, every school pickup, every holiday photo. Like those things were a receipt that excused everything else. And my dad would sit there the way he always did, quiet, tired, pretending the truth was too heavy to lift. I had lived inside that pattern my whole life. Something in me finally understood that the pattern wasn't going to change because I asked nicely. I sat down at my small kitchen table, the same one where I'd been drinking coffee that morning when the bank call came through. My mug was still there, cold now, a pale ring of dried coffee at the bottom. I stared at it and tried to think like an adult, not a hurt kid. What were my options? I could try student loans, but I'd need paperwork and time, and it wouldn't solve the larger problem that my parents had taken something that wasn't theirs and told me to accept it. I could take on a second job and postpone school, but even the thought of delaying my program made my chest tighten. I'd worked too hard to get to this point. I'd earned this acceptance. I'd planned my life around that fund because I had been told for years that it was there. And then, like it always did when I was growing up, my mind went to my grandmother, Margaret Lewis. She was 74 now, living in Spokane, Washington, in a little house that always smelled like lemon polish and peppermint tea. She was the only person in my family who never treated my goals like background noise. When I was 19, home from my freshman year of college, she'd slid an envelope across her kitchen table. Inside was a photocopy of a statement, nothing fancy, just a balance printed in plain type. Keep this, she'd told me. People forget what they promised. Paper doesn't. At the time, I'd thought it was just one of her old school habits. Margaret had grown up in an era where you saved receipts and you paid bills on time because that was how you kept your life steady. Now, sitting alone in my apartment with the bank printout in front of me, I realized that envelope might have meant more than I understood. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. I only knew I couldn't pretend this was normal. I picked up my phone and scrolled to her name. My thumb hovered over the call button. Once I pressed it, something would shift. Not in the bank account, maybe not right away, but in my family. I took a breath and I hit call. My grandmother answered on the second ring. "Claire," she said, her voice warm and steady, the way it had sounded my entire life. "Everything all right, sweetheart?" For a moment, I almost said yes. That old reflex, to keep the peace, to smooth things over, rose up before I could stop it. But the bank statement was still sitting on the table in front of me, and the number on it refused to disappear. "No," I said quietly. "Not really." There was a pause. Margaret Lewis had spent 40 years teaching 4th grade before she retired, and she had the patience of someone who understood that silence sometimes said more than words. "Tell me what happened," she said. So I did. I told her about the call from the bank that Tuesday morning. I told her the balance, $214. I told her about the transfer to the Meridian Real Estate Company. And finally, I told her about dinner at my parents' house and the way my mother had explained it. I expected shock, anger, maybe. But what came through the phone instead was something else, a long, thoughtful breath. "They used it for Ethan's house," she said slowly. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Another quiet pause. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten again. I was afraid of that. I sat up straighter in my chair. "What do you mean Margaret didn't answer right away?" I could hear a chair scrape softly across her kitchen floor on the other end of the line, the faint clink of porcelain as she set something down. "Claire," she said carefully, "I want you to come see me. Grandma, I can drive up this weekend." "Tomorrow," she said, gently but firmly. It was a little after 6 in the evening. Spokane was about 6 hours from Boise by car. "Tomorrow," I repeated. "Yes." Her tone wasn't dramatic. It was calm, practical the way she spoke when she had already made up her mind. "Bring any bank statements you have," she added. "Print them out if you can." I glanced down at this paper in front of me. "I already have one." "Good," she said. There was another pause, softer this time. "You remember the blue box in my kitchen cabinet?" she asked. I blinked. The image came back to me immediately. A small metal box with chipped blue paint that always sat on the top shelf of her kitchen pantry. "You used to keep coupons in it," I said. Margaret chuckled quietly. "I used to keep a lot of things in it." My fingers tightened around the phone. "What's in it now, paper?" she said simply. "The kind people forget about until they need it." I didn't fully understand what she meant, but something in her voice made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Grandma," I said, "are you saying you kept records of the fund?" All of them. Every word she spoke sounded deliberate. Every statement the bank ever sent me. Every deposit slip. Every letter. The room suddenly felt smaller. "You kept all of that, yes." "Why?" For the first time since the conversation began, her voice carried a trace of something heavier than calm. "Because I know my daughter." The sentence hung in the air between us. Margaret didn't say anything else about my mother. She didn't need to. Instead, she cleared her throat lightly. "You drive up tomorrow, Claire. We'll sit at the kitchen table and go through everything together." "Okay." "And sweetheart, yes, try not to argue with your parents tonight." I looked down at the statement again. "I wasn't planning to." "Good," she said softly. "Because the less noise there is right now, the clearer we'll be able to see what's really happened." After we hung up, I stayed at the kitchen table for a long time. Outside, the Boise evening had gone dark. Streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, and somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and then went quiet again. I folded the bank printout carefully and slid it back into my purse. For the first time since that morning, I had the strange feeling that something bigger then a family argument had started to move. And tomorrow, 6 hours north in my grandmother's kitchen, I was going to find out exactly what. By the time I reached Spokane the next afternoon, the inside of my chest felt like it was packed with wet sand. The drive north had been long and quiet. I stopped once for gas, once for coffee, and the whole way I kept thinking about my master's program, how close it was, how fragile it suddenly felt. My acceptance letter was folded in my bag, like a promise I didn't know how to keep anymore. Margaret was waiting when I pulled into her driveway, bundled in a quilted coat, her silver hair tucked neatly under a knit cap. She hugged me the way she always did, firm, steady, then guided me inside without asking for details. She'd already heard the story. Today wasn't for explaining. It was for seeing. Her kitchen smelled like peppermint and dish soap. The same porch swing creaked outside the window. Everything about her house made the world feel stable, which only highlighted how unstable mine had become. "Sit," she said, nodding toward the kitchen table. On the table sat the blue metal box I remembered from childhood. The chipped paint caught the light, and for a second, I saw myself, at 10 years old, swinging my legs under a chair while Grandma clipped coupons. Margaret opened the box and started laying papers out in neat stacks. Statements, deposit slips, letters from the bank with dates printed in the corners, everything tabbed and labeled in her careful handwriting. And there, in the middle of it all, was the account information with my name on it. Not my parents', not my brother's, mine. I swallowed hard. "You kept all of this," I said. "I kept what mattered," she replied. She slid my bank printout, my sad little $214 balance, into the pile, like it belonged there, like it was just another piece of evidence. Then she pointed to a business card, sitting at the top of the stack. "Daniel Whitaker, attorney at law." "I made an appointment," she said, "for 3 o'clock. I looked at the clock on her microwave. It was 2:12. "Grandma, are we really doing this?" Margaret didn't raise her voice. She didn't scold. She just looked at me over her reading glasses, calm as a lighthouse. "Claire, she said your mother told you Ethan is the one who matters. If you accept that you're agreeing, she was right." That hit harder than any legal term could have, because she was right. This wasn't just money. It was a message, the same message I'd heard in smaller ways my whole life. Your needs are negotiable. Margaret pressed her hand over mine, her fingers warm and thin. "I saved that fund so you'd have choices," she said. "Not so someone else could spend your future." At 3 o'clock sharp, we walked into Daniel Whitaker's office downtown. He was in his early 60s, with neatly combed gray hair and the kind of posture that made you think he'd spent a lifetime in courtrooms. His handshake was firm. His eyes were kind, but direct. He listened, without interrupting, while Margaret explained the fund, how long she'd saved, how the account was set up, what the bank had said. Then he turned to me. "Claire," he asked, "did you authorize any withdrawals from this account?" "No," I said. My voice sounded small in that quiet office. I didn't even know they were happening. He nodded once, then opened one of Margaret's folders. "This is a custodial account," he said, tapping a page with a finger. "That means the money is held for the benefit of the named beneficiary." He pointed to my name. "You." My stomach twisted. So, they weren't allowed to use it. For Ethan Daniels' expression didn't change. "Using those funds to purchase property for someone else is not an accident," he said. "It's a choice, and legally it's a serious one." Margaret sat beside me perfectly still. "What are her options?" she asked. Daniel folded his hands. "Two," he said. A civil action to recover the money. And a criminal report. You can pursue one or both. The word criminal hung in the air. I thought about my father's quiet eyes, my mother's calm voice, Ethan's house photo glowing on his phone like a trophy. I felt something in me harden not into hate, but into clarity. I looked at Daniel, then at my grandmother, and I nodded. Both I said. Friday morning in Spokane felt strangely calm. The kind of calm that comes after a decision has already been made. Margaret was up before me, moving around her kitchen in the quiet, deliberate way she did everything. By the time I walked in, the kettle was already steaming, and the blue metal box was sitting open on the table again, the paper stacked in the same neat columns as the day before. For the first time since Tuesday, I slept a full night. Not because the situation had improved. Nothing about it had. But something inside me had shifted the moment I said both in Daniel Whitaker's office. The silence I'd been living with my whole life had finally ended. Margaret slid a mug of peppermint tea toward me and nodded at the folder Daniel had sent home with us. "Call your parents," she said. The words hung in the air. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat settle into my fingers. "You think I should tell them already?" Margaret gave a small shrug. "They're going to find out anyway. Better they hear it from you than from a letter with a law firm's logo." She had a point. And suddenly, the idea of another quiet dinner at their kitchen table, pretending this was still a misunderstanding, felt impossible. I took my phone out of my pocket. For a moment, I stared at my father's name. Then I pressed call. He answered on the third ring. "Claire." His voice sounded cautious, the way people sound when they already know the conversation won't be easy. "Hi, Dad." A pause. "You still up in Spokane?" "Yes." Another pause. Then he said the thing people say when they don't want to talk about what actually matters. "How's your grandmother doing?" "She's fine." Silence stretched across the line. Finally, I said it. "I met with a lawyer yesterday." The quiet that followed was heavier than any argument. When my father spoke again, his voice had dropped. "A lawyer?" "Yes." For what I kept my tone steady. "For the college fund." I could hear him shift on the other end of the phone. A chair creaked faintly. "Claire," he said slowly, "your mother told you we used some of that money for Ethan's house." "Not some," I said. "Most of it." Another long pause. Then he tried the explanation I had expected. It was a family decision. I looked down at the papers on Margaret's table, the statements, the deposit slips, my name printed clearly on the account documents. "It wasn't your money to decide about," I said. My father didn't raise his voice. He wasn't the type. Instead, he sighed. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be." Behind me, Margaret moved quietly around the kitchen, pretending not to listen. "I've filed paperwork to recover the money," I said. This time, there was no mistaking the reaction. "What paperwork?" "With an attorney." "And what exactly does that mean?" he asked. "It means," I said carefully, "that the withdrawals are being reviewed." The line went silent. Then my father said something I hadn't expected. "You told your grandmother." It wasn't a question. "Yes." Another long breath on the other end. "Claire," he said, his voice tighter. "Now, your mother is going to be very upset about this." For the first time since Tuesday, I felt something like anger spark in my chest. "She should be," I said. He didn't respond right away. Finally, he said, "Let's not do anything we can't take back." But the thing about certain decisions is that once you say them out loud, there's no way to return to the version of life that existed before. I already did, I said. After we hung up, Margaret placed a hand on my shoulder. Outside, the Spokane sky was bright and clear, the kind of blue that makes everything look simpler than it really is. But somewhere, 6 hours south, in Meridian, the first cracks in my family's story had just begun to spread. And this time, they weren't going to stay hidden. The first message arrived Saturday morning. I was still at Margaret's house in Spokane, sitting at the kitchen table with the blue metal box open in front of me. Papers were spread across the surface. Bank statements, deposit slips, photocopies of old account letters. Margaret had a yellow legal pad beside her, where she was writing down dates. The quiet was almost comforting, until my phone buzzed. It was a text from my brother. Ethan, Claire, Mom says you called Dad about the fund. What's going on? I stared at the message for a long moment before answering. Ask Mom. 3 dots appeared on the screen, then disappeared. Then came the second message. She says you're threatening to sue the family. I felt my stomach tighten. Threatening. That wasn't the word Daniel Whitaker had used. Margaret glanced up from the papers when she noticed my expression change. Something wrong, Ethan texted, I said. She nodded slowly, as if she'd expected that. What did your mother tell him? That I'm threatening the family with a lawsuit. Margaret let out a quiet breath through her nose. Well, she said calmly, that's one way to describe accountability. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a text. It was a Facebook notification. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. When I opened the app, my mother's profile picture appeared at the top of the screen. A new post. My chest tightened before I even read it. Please, keep our family in your prayers. We're going through a difficult misunderstanding involving finances. It's heartbreaking when someone you love turns against you. Dozens of reactions already sat under the post. Hearts, prayer hands, comments from neighbors and church friends. Stay strong, Linda. Families go through hard seasons. Praying for healing. I stared at the screen, feeling something cold settle behind my ribs. She hadn't said my name, but she didn't have to. Margaret watched my face carefully. What is it? I turned the phone toward her. She read the post without speaking. Then she reached for her glasses and read it again. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. She's getting ahead of the story, Margaret said. The phrase sounded almost clinical, like something a teacher might say when explaining a lesson. But I understood exactly what she meant. My mother wasn't apologizing. She was preparing. People are already commenting, I said quietly. Margaret nodded. They always do. Most of them think I'm the one causing the problem. She gave me a long, steady look. Truth moves slower than gossip, she said. But it lasts longer. I wanted to believe that. But right then, scrolling through the comments, it didn't feel true. These were people I had known for years. Neighbors who had come to our backyard barbecues. Women from my mother's church group who used to bring casseroles when someone in the community was sick. And they were all reacting to a story that wasn't real. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was my father. I didn't answer. The call went to voicemail. Seconds later, another text appeared. You need to stop talking to people about this. Margaret noticed the message before I could hide the screen. She gave a small shake of her head. They're scared. Of what? That the truth might come out before they're ready. I set the phone down slowly. Mom already started telling people her version. Margaret closed the lid of the blue metal box with a soft click. Yes, she said. And now we decide whether we stay quiet or whether the real story gets told. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon sun was starting to drop behind the tall pine trees that lined her street. Somewhere 6 hours south, my mother had already taken the first swing. And suddenly, it was clear that this wasn't just about recovering money anymore. It was about who controlled the truth. On Monday morning, Margaret drove us downtown. The weekend had been a blur of missed calls and half-truths floating around Facebook. I'd watched my mother's post gather more comments, more prayer hands, more people who didn't ask a single question before taking her side. By Sunday night, I felt wrung out, like my emotions had been used up and replaced with something flatter, harder. Not peace, resolve. Margaret didn't talk much on the drive. She didn't have to. She just kept both hands on the steering wheel and her eyes on the road, like she was taking us somewhere important, which she was. Daniel Whitaker's office was in the same brick building downtown Spokane. Inside, the air smelled like printer toner and old carpet. Daniel greeted us with the same calm efficiency as before, but this time, there was a stack of papers waiting on his desk. I drafted the civil demand, he said, sliding a packet toward Margaret. It's not a lawsuit yet. It's a formal notice. A chance to return the funds before we file. I stared at the packet. My name was printed on the top page in bold. So were my parents' names. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like stepping onto a bridge that could only go one direction. Daniel continued matter of fact. The bank has already been contacted for records. They'll respond within their standard time frame. Once we have the full history, we can quantify every withdrawal. Every withdrawal. Hearing it that way, clinical documented, made the whole situation feel less like family drama and more like what it actually was, a series of choices with dates and amounts attached. Margaret flipped through the pages without blinking. And the criminal side, she asked. Daniel's expression stayed careful. We can make a report. The county will decide whether to investigate. But either way, you need to be prepared for pushback. Pushback. I thought of my mother's Facebook post. The way she'd turned herself into the wounded one with a few sentences and a prayer emoji. I already got it, I said quietly. Daniel nodded. Then, here's what I recommend. Stop responding emotionally. Don't argue online. Don't defend yourself in comments. Save everything. Screenshots, messages, voicemails. Patterns matter. Patterns. That word landed differently. Because it wasn't just the money. It was the way my mother moved, always first, always loud, always painting herself as the victim before anyone could ask for facts. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out her yellow legal pad. I've been writing down dates, she said. Not just bank dates, social dates. When Ethan closed on the house. When Linda posted on Facebook. When Robert called you. Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly, impressed, despite himself. That's useful, he said. Very useful. I realized something in that moment that made my stomach go cold, and then strangely steady. My mistake had been thinking this was about a single confrontation. It wasn't. It was about the record, the paper trail, the timeline, the truth, organized. When we left Daniel's office, Margaret didn't head back to her house right away. She stopped at a small copy shop 2 blocks away, the kind of place with faded posters in the window and a bell that jingled when you walked in. We made copies of everything, the bank printouts, the old statements, the deposit slips, the account letters. Margaret labeled each folder with her neat teacher handwriting. She slid the copies into a plain cardboard file box and closed it, like she was sealing something important. Back in her kitchen, my phone buzzed again. Ethan. This time, it wasn't a text. It was a call. I stared at his name until the screen dimmed, then lit again. Margaret watched me calm. Answer, she said. I swallowed and picked up. Claire, Ethan said, and his voice didn't sound confident anymore. I need to ask you something. About the money, Claire, Ethan said again, like he wasn't sure I was still on the line. I'm not trying to fight with you. I need to understand. I leaned my elbow on Margaret's kitchen counter and looked at the closed cardboard file box on the table. The one full of copies. The one that made this feel less like a family argument and more like something that could be proven. "What do you want to know?" I asked. His breath came out rough, audible through the phone. "Mom told me the money was kind of shared," he said. "Like, Grandma put it away for the family, and Dad had the right to move it around. She said it was a custodial thing, and it didn't really belong to you yet." There it was. The story she was using to keep him on her side. I didn't argue. I didn't insult her. I didn't even raise my voice. I walked over to the file box and flipped it open. "Hold on," I said. I pulled out one of the copies Margaret had labeled in her neat handwriting. The account document, the page with my name printed plainly on it. "Ethan," I said, "the beneficiary is me. The account was set up for me. Not for you, not for Mom, not for the family." Silence. Then quieter. "Can you send me that?" I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew what it meant. Once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. "I can," I said, "but I'm not doing this over text screenshots. If you want to understand, drive up here. Grandma's kitchen. Same table, same papers." Another pause. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll come tomorrow." Tuesday afternoon, Ethan walked into Margaret's house like a man stepping into court. He looked older than he had at dinner in Meridian. His shoulders were tight. His eyes were red around the edges, like he hadn't slept. He didn't make jokes. He didn't grin. He just nodded at me, and then at Margaret, respectful in a way I hadn't seen from him in years. Margaret didn't hug him. She didn't scold him either. She simply gestured to the table. "Sit," she said. Ethan sat. Margaret opened the blue metal box and laid the documents out in a clean line. The account statements, the deposit records, the custodian information. Then she placed the beneficiary page in front of him. He stared at my name, Claire Bennett. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he swallowed and looked up at me. "I didn't know," he said, and his voice cracked. "Claire, I swear I didn't know." I believed him. That was the worst part. I believed him. Because Ethan had always been selfish in the way people can afford to be when someone else is cleaning up their messes. But he wasn't a mastermind. He wasn't careful enough for that. He rubbed his palms against his jeans. "Mom said it was a home loan," he whispered. "She showed me paperwork. Something about equity. I didn't question it. I thought Dad signed off because it was legitimate." Margaret's mouth pressed into a thin line. "People like your mother count on you not questioning," she said quietly. Ethan flinched at that, but he didn't argue. He turned back to the papers, reading more carefully now. The dates, the amounts, the pattern. When he finally spoke again, his voice was flat. "So the house is basically paid for with your money." "Yes," I said. He sat back like he'd been punched. For the first time since this started, I watched the consequence land on someone other than me. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone. "I'm calling a lawyer," he said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "For what?" He looked at me then, down at the papers again. "To fix it," he said. "If the money came from you, then the house doesn't belong to me the way I thought it did." I didn't feel relief. Not yet. I felt the stakes rise, like the air pressure before a storm. Because if Ethan sold that house, my parents would have nowhere to hide. And they knew it. 3 months later, the house sold. Ethan called me the morning the paperwork was finalized. His voice sounded different than it had that first night on the phone. Less frantic, steadier, like someone who had spent weeks thinking carefully about every step. "It closed today," he said. "The funds are being transferred to Daniel's escrow account this afternoon." I sat at Margaret's kitchen table while he spoke the same table where the blue metal box still rested in its usual place by the window. Autumn sunlight filtered through the curtains, turning the dust in the air into small floating sparks. How much, I asked. After fees, just under $180,000, he said. Daniel said it'll cover most of what was taken. Most. The rest had already been addressed in a different way. 2 weeks earlier, Daniel Whitaker had received a formal response from my parents' attorney. It wasn't an apology. Not exactly. But it was something close to surrender. My father had agreed to repay the remaining balance in structured payments secured legally through the same firm handling the escrow. The civil filing never had to move forward to court. Once the documents were signed, the timeline of withdrawals was no longer something they could deny. The truth had weight once it was written down. And my mother, for the first time in my life, had nothing left to argue with. I'm sorry it took me this long to see it, Ethan said quietly on the phone. I looked down at the table, tracing the edge of a coffee ring someone had left weeks ago. You came when it mattered, I said. That seemed to be enough for both of us. When we hung up, Margaret walked in from the backyard, carrying a basket of late tomatoes from her garden. She set it on the counter and studied my face for a moment. It's done, she asked. Yes, she nodded once, satisfied. Not triumphant, just certain. The money arrived in Daniel's escrow account that afternoon. Within a week, the transfers were complete. The account that had once been emptied down to almost nothing was rebuilt, not in exactly the same shape as before, but strong enough to do what it was always meant to do: protect my future. Margaret insisted on one final meeting at her lawyer's office before everything closed. She sat straight-backed across from Daniel Whitaker, the blue metal box resting beside her like a quiet witness. When the final documents were signed, she placed one hand on top of the lid. 18 years, she said softly. Daniel smiled. Looks like they paid off. Margaret didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned toward me. Money isn't the point, she said. Respect is. I understood what she meant. The real change had already happened long before the escrow closed. For the first time in my life, the story about me, my future, my choices, my worth, was no longer something other people could rewrite behind my back. Winter came early to Spokane that year. By December, the sidewalks were edged with snow, and the pine trees behind Margaret's house carried a thin, white layer on their branches. I stood on her porch one evening with a mug of hot tea, watching the quiet street, while the wind chimes tapped softly in the cold air. Inside the house, Margaret was humming while she washed dishes. The blue metal box was back in its drawer, not hidden, just resting. Some stories don't end with a dramatic victory. They end with something quieter, like the moment you realize the ground beneath your feet is finally steady again. If you've ever faced a moment where family and fairness collided, I'd really like to hear how you handled it. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider liking and subscribing so you don't miss the next one waiting just ahead.